The Velhari trade station hung in the black between two dying suns like a jewel that did not know it was about to be stained with blood. Captain Lena Vasquez stepped off the shuttle with her diplomatic team behind her and her 8-year-old daughter Maya holding her hand, and looking up at the enormous curved ceiling of the station with wide eyes that reflected every light like tiny mirrors. "Mama, the ceiling looks like it is breathing," Maya whispered. Lena smiled and squeezed her hand and told her it was the station's atmospheric processors cycling air through the massive dome, and that it was perfectly safe, and Maya nodded, but kept staring upward because she was the kind of child who found wonder in everything she touched. The humans had been a spacefaring species for roughly 200 years, and in that time they had built colonies and trade routes, and a reputation for being stubborn and loud, and strangely emotional about things that other species found unremarkable, and most of the elder civilizations tolerated humanity, the way one tolerates a dog that has wandered into a formal dinner and refuses to leave. The Confederacy of the 12 Suns controlled most of the galaxy, and had done so for 6,000 years, and their strongest voice belonged to the Athari, a species of tall, sharp-featured beings with skin like polished stone and eyes that held no warmth, and they had built empires before humanity had learned to make fire, and they never let anyone forget it. High Regent Salvan of the Athari stood at the far end of the reception hall when the humans entered, and he watched them with an expression that was somewhere between boredom and disgust. And when he saw the child, his thin mouth curled into something that was not quite a smile. "They bring their young to a summit of civilizations," he said to his aide, without lowering his voice, and several delegates from other species turned to look, and some of them shifted uncomfortably, because Salvan did not whisper when he wanted to wound. The aide nodded and said that humans were known for this, and that they believed bringing family to negotiations showed good faith and trust. "It shows ignorance," Salvan replied and turned away. Lena heard him and she felt her jaw tighten, but she had been a diplomat for 15 years and she knew when to swallow her pride, and she knelt beside Maya and told her to go explore the station's garden level, where other children from visiting species were playing, and Maya's face lit up the way only a child's face can when the whole universe feels like a playground. Over the next 2 days, Maya became a small ambassador of her own making. She found the garden level, and within an hour she was sitting cross-legged on the floor with 3 Korath younglings and a pair of tiny feathered Selvani children drawing pictures with the crayons she carried everywhere in her backpack. And the alien children did not speak her language, and she did not speak theirs, but she drew a picture of herself holding hands with all of them under a sky full of stars, and she held it up and pointed and laughed, and they understood perfectly. A Korath elder passing through the garden stopped and watched the scene for a long time, and later that evening, he sent a message to his homeworld that simply said, "The humans have something we lost a long time ago, and I do not think they know how rare it is." Meanwhile, the negotiations went badly. The Athari had no intention of granting humanity mining rights to the Outer Belt territories, and the summit was a performance designed to humiliate the human delegation in front of the Confederacy, and prove that the younger species had no place at the table of civilizations. And Salvan made this clear in every session with remarks that were sharp enough to cut, but polished enough to deny. On the second night, Lena sat in her quarters reviewing the day's recordings, and Maya climbed into her lap and showed her a new drawing, and in it, a tall figure with stone-colored skin stood next to a small girl with brown hair, and they were both smiling. "Who is that?" Lena asked. "That is the tall man from the big room," Maya said. "I have not met him yet, but I think he looks sad, so I drew him happy." Lena looked at the drawing of High Regent Salvan smiling next to her daughter, and she felt something cold move through her chest, but she kissed Maya's head and told her it was beautiful and put her to bed. On the morning of the 3rd day, everything fell apart. The negotiations collapsed when Salvan publicly declared that humanity lacked the cultural maturity to manage interstellar resource claims, and that their presence at the summit was a courtesy that had been extended too generously. And he suggested the humans return to their home system and come back in another 1,000 years when they had grown up. Lena kept her composure and formally withdrew the delegation and began preparing for departure. At 1400 hours station time, a controlled explosive device detonated in the corridor, connecting the human delegation's wing to the central hub. It was small and precise, and the kind of device that left no chemical signature that could be traced, and the Athari had used such devices before to send messages to species that did not know their place, and the blast was calculated to damage the corridor and frighten the humans into a faster retreat. But Maya had left her crayons in the garden level that morning, and she had gone back to get them. She was in that corridor when the device went off. The station's medical team arrived in 3 minutes, but there was nothing to be done, and the doctor who knelt beside the small body looked up at the approaching human delegation with an expression that needed no translation across any species barrier. Lena Vasquez walked through the smoke and the dust and the shattered glass, and she saw her daughter lying on the floor with her backpack still on her shoulders, and the crayons scattered around her like small colorful bones, and the drawing of Solvan smiling was crumpled under her hand. She knelt and lifted Maya into her arms, and the child weighed almost nothing, and the station went quiet around her, as if the universe itself had stopped to hold its breath. There was no sound in that corridor for a very long time. 40 minutes later, a formal message arrived from the Athari delegation, and it read, "The Confederacy regrets the unfortunate incident involving structural failure in the human wing, and offers condolences for any inconvenience caused to the departing delegation, and suggests that in the future human envoys consider leaving dependents in more secure locations." Solvan signed it personally. Lena read the message in the medical bay while still holding her daughter, and her face did not change, and her hands did not shake, and the officers around her said nothing, because they had never seen that kind of stillness in a living person, and it frightened them more than screaming would have. She looked at the communications officer standing by the door, and he straightened because something in her eyes made his spine lock on instinct. "Get me Earth," she said, "Priority 1. The officer moved faster than he had ever moved in his career. Somewhere in the garden level, the Koreth younglings waited for the human girl who drew stars to come back and play, and they waited for a long time, and she never came. And the crayons lay scattered in a corridor that smelled of smoke and silence, and the drawing of a tall alien smiling next to a small girl fluttered once in the recycled air, and then was still. The quantum link carried the message from the Valhari station to Earth in 11 minutes, and in those 11 minutes the universe was still the same place it had been for 6,000 years, and the Confederacy of the 12 Suns still ruled, and the Athari still believed they were untouchable. And then the message arrived, and everything began to change. The United Human Council was in a routine session when the Priority 1 signal cut through every channel simultaneously, and the chamber went silent, and the holographic display at the center of the room activated without authorization, and showed the image of Captain Lena Vasquez holding her dead daughter in a corridor filled with smoke and scattered crayons. No one spoke. The image was not censored, and it was not edited, and it showed everything, and the council members who were parents looked away, and then looked back, because looking away felt like a betrayal, and the ones who were not parents looked at the ones who were, and saw something in their faces that they had never seen before. Council Speaker Adjora Akafer stood at her podium with both hands flat on the surface, and her voice, when it came, was steady, but it carried a weight that pressed against the walls of the chamber like a physical thing. "How old?" she asked. 8 years old, the communications officer replied. Her name was Maya Vasquez. The chamber remained silent for another 30 seconds, and in the history of the United Human Council, No silence had ever lasted that long, and when it broke, it did not break with shouting or arguments or political maneuvering. It broke with a single word from Speaker Kethforin. Unanimous. She did not need to explain what she meant. Within 1 hour, the image of Maya reached every human colony and every orbital station and every deep space vessel and every outpost on every moon that humanity had ever touched. And what happened next was something that no species in the recorded history of the galaxy had ever witnessed. Humanity stopped arguing. On Earth, the political factions that had fought each other for decades went quiet, and the opposition leaders who had spent their careers criticizing the ruling council stood up and walked across the aisle and sat beside the people they had opposed and said nothing because nothing needed to be said. On the colony world of New Sao Paulo, a factory that manufactured agricultural equipment shut down its production lines, and the workers reprogrammed the fabricators and began producing ship components without waiting for orders, and the factory owner watched. And when someone asked him who had authorized the change, he said no one had, and no one needed to. On Mars, a retired admiral named James Ake, who had not worn his uniform in 11 years, opened his closet and put it on and walked to the nearest recruitment center and found a line of 400 people already waiting, and most of them were not soldiers and had never been soldiers, but they were there and they were not leaving. The recruitment servers crashed 3 times in the first 6 hours. Civilian engineers who built bridges and towers and habitation domes volunteered for fleet yard duty, and they did not ask what they would be paid, and they did not ask how long it would take, and they packed their tools and went. And across every human world the vigils began. Candles and lights appeared in windows and on rooftops and in parks and fields, and the faces of the people who held them were not angry and not sad, but something else entirely. And it was a look that the galaxy had never seen on a human face before. And it was the look of a species that had made a decision together without speaking a single word to each other. The Confederacy's intelligence networks detected the mobilization within hours, and they sent reports to the council chambers on Kethforin, and the analysts were confused, because the data did not match any known pattern of military response. They appear to be mobilizing their entire fleet. An Athari intelligence officer reported to High Regent Salvan, all branches and all reserves and all civilian auxiliary vessels. Salvan looked at the report the way one looks at a small insect on a windowsill. "For what purpose?" he asked. "We believe they intend to deliver a formal protest and possibly impose trade sanctions." Salvan made a sound that was the Athari equivalent of laughter and waved the officer away, and said that humans were emotional creatures who would exhaust themselves with grand gestures, and then return to their little corner of the galaxy where they belonged. He was wrong in a way that would cost his civilization everything. Several species within the Confederacy began sending diplomatic messages to the Human Council offering to mediate, and the humans responded to each message with the same 3 words: "We are coming." No explanation and no demands and no timeline, and just those 3 words repeated in every language to every species that asked. And the repetition was more frightening than any threat could have been, because a species that threatens is a species that still wants to negotiate, and a species that simply tells you it is coming has already decided what happens next. The Koreth, who were the oldest living civilization in the known galaxy, and who had watched empires rise and fall like tides, sent a message to the Confederacy Council, and it read, "You do not understand what you have done, and we say this not as allies of humanity, but as students of history, and we have seen this before in species that bond to their young the way humans do, and what comes next cannot be stopped with weapons or words or treaties." The Confederacy Council debated the message for 2 hours, and then dismissed it as the rambling of an aging species that had lost its relevance. The Koreth then sent a private message directly to High Regent Salvan, and it was shorter, and it said, Surrender the ones responsible and do it now, and do not hesitate, and do not negotiate, and do not posture, because we have seen your kind before, and we have also seen theirs. And they are not coming to defeat you, and they are not coming to conquer you, and they are coming to make a point that this galaxy will remember for 10,000 years. And if you are wise, you will give them what they want before they take everything you have. Salvan deleted the message without finishing it. Meanwhile, the Terran fleet moved, and it did not move the way military fleets moved with formations and strike groups and tactical positioning, and instead it moved the way a migration moves, and the way a tide moves, and the way a storm moves when it has already decided where it is going. Every ship that humanity possessed left its port and joined the stream, and the sensor networks of a dozen species lit up with signatures that stretched across entire sectors, and the analysts who tracked the movement ran their calculations twice, and then 3 times, because the numbers could not be right. But the numbers were right. The entire output of a civilization had turned and pointed itself at a single destination, and the fleet was not a fleet anymore, and it was a statement written in metal and fire and silence, and it said, "We are all coming, and every single one of us, and we will not stop, and we will not slow down, and we will not negotiate." And across the galaxy, the species that watched the sensor data felt something that most of them had not felt in thousands of years. They felt afraid. Not of the ships and not of the weapons, but of the unity, because no species in recorded history had ever done this before, and no species had ever agreed so completely, and so quickly, and so silently on anything. And the question that every analyst and diplomat and philosopher began to ask was the same question. What kind of species does this? And the answer was simple and terrible. The kind that lost a child. The Athari 7th Armada was the most decorated military force in the history of the Confederacy, and it had broken rebellions and shattered invasions, and held the borders of Athari space for 3,000 years without a single defeat, and its commander, Admiral Tyeth, had earned every medal on his chest through blood and patience and ruthless precision. He positioned his fleet along the border of Athari space in a formation called the Burning Wall, which had never been breached, and he looked at the sensor data showing the approaching human fleet, and he felt confident because his ships outnumbered the human vanguard 3-1, and his weapons were the finest the Confederacy had ever built, and he had fought wars before this one and won them all. The human vanguard dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the formation, and for a moment there was silence on both sides as the two fleets faced each other across a gap of empty space that seemed to hold its breath. Admiral Tyeth opened a communications channel and delivered the formal Athari warning, which was ancient and practiced, and had been spoken to 100 species before, and it promised destruction to any who crossed the burning wall. The humans did not respond. Tyeth waited 30 seconds and then repeated the warning. Silence. He ordered his fleet to power weapons and prepare for engagement, and around him, the 7th Armada came alive with the hum of energy systems charging and targeting, arrays locking and shield generators cycling to full power, and it was a sound that had made lesser species surrender on the spot. The human vanguard moved forward. The battle lasted 4 minutes. In the first 30 seconds, the human ships released something that the Athari sensors could not identify, and it spread through the burning wall formation like fog, and every Athari navigation system went dark simultaneously, and the ships that had held perfect formation for 3,000 years began to drift. In the next 60 seconds, the human weapons fired, and they were not the crude kinetic projectors and plasma cannons that the Confederacy's intelligence reports had described, and instead they were something else entirely, and the beams found every Athari engine and cut through them with a precision that should not have been possible at that range and the speed. In the following 2 minutes, the human fleet moved through the 7th Armada the way water moves through broken stone, and every weapon system on every Athari ship was disabled, and every communications array was severed, and every shield generator was burned out. And when it was finished, the burning wall was dark and silent and drifting. But the life support systems on every ship were still running. Admiral Tyeth stood on the bridge of his flagship surrounded by dead screens and silent consoles, and he realized that his ship was intact, and his crew was alive, and the air was still flowing, and the gravity was still working, and the humans had done something far more terrifying than destroying his fleet. They had dismantled it while keeping everyone inside alive. This was not mercy, and he knew that immediately because mercy comes from a position of compassion, and what the humans had done came from a position of absolute control, and the message was clear, and it said we could have killed every single one of you, and we chose not to, and that choice can change at any time. Across the galaxy, the sensor data from the engagement spread like fire through dry grass, and the military analysts of every species watched the recordings and ran them again and again, because what they showed was impossible. The humans had been in the galaxy for 200 years, and for 200 years, they had been considered a minor species with crude technology and loud voices, and an embarrassing attachment to their offspring, and every intelligence agency in the Confederacy had filed them under manageable and moved on. They had been wrong. During those 200 years, while the elder species rested on the technology they had built millennia ago, and saw no reason to improve humanity had been building, and they had built in secret and in silence, and they had innovated with the desperate, relentless energy of a species that knew it was surrounded by giants. Adaptive nano-armor that could reshape itself in microseconds to deflect any weapon, it encountered an AI-driven tactical swarms that processed battlefield data faster than any organic mind could follow, and gravitational manipulation, arrays that could crush a ship or hold it perfectly still, and FTL interdiction nets that could trap an entire fleet in real space like insects in amber. The elder species had never developed these things because they had never needed to, because no one had challenged them in thousands of years, and stagnation had crept in like rust on iron, and they had mistaken their ancient power for permanent power, and they had been comfortable, and comfort had made them blind. The human fleet did not pause after the 7th Armada, and it continued moving through Athari space, and every defense station it encountered was disabled in the same surgical fashion, and every fleet that tried to stop it was taken apart with the same terrible precision, and the crews were always left alive, and the life support as always running, and the message was always the same. We are not here to kill you, and we are here for something else. The fleet surrounded the fortress world of Kethforin, which was the capital of the Athari civilization, and the seat of High Regent Solvan's power, and the planet had orbital defense platforms that had been built over centuries, and ground-based weapons that could crack moons, and a planetary shield that had never been tested, because no one had ever been foolish enough to come this close. The human fleet settled into position around the world like a hand closing around a throat, and then it stopped and waited. And then it spoke. On every frequency, and in every language, and on every communications channel across the entire galaxy, the human fleet broadcast a single message, and it was heard by every species on every world and every station and every ship. A child named Maya Vasquez was murdered, and she was 8 years old, and she liked to draw stars, and we are here for the ones who killed her, and only them, and anyone who stands in our way has made their choice. The message repeated once, and then the fleet went silent. Within hours, the Confederacy began to break apart, and the fractures that had been hidden for centuries cracked open under the pressure of what was happening at Kethforin, and 3 member species formally withdrew from the Confederacy before the day was over, and 2 more condemned the Athari publicly, and opened their borders to human ships, and offered fuel and supplies, and 1 species sent a message to the human fleet that simply said, "We are sorry about your daughter." The remaining Confederacy members sent frantic messages to Solvan, demanding that he surrender and negotiate, and do anything to stop what was coming, and Salvan ignored them all because his pride was older than human civilization, and he could not bring himself to bow to a species he considered beneath him. Then a ship arrived at the edge of the human fleet, and it was not a warship, and it was the same diplomatic shuttle that had carried the human delegation to the Velhari station, and it docked with the flagship, and Captain Lena Vasquez walked onto the bridge. She was not wearing her diplomatic uniform anymore. She carried a folder under her arm, and inside the folder were drawings made with crayons, and they showed aliens and humans holding hands under skis full of stars, and they were drawn by a girl who had believed that the universe was full of friends waiting to be met. Lena Vasquez stood on the bridge of the flagship looking down at the world that sheltered the man who had killed her daughter, and she transmitted the fleet's final demands to the surface in her own voice, and it did not shake, and it did not rise, and it was calm, and that calmness carried more weight than any weapon in the fleet. Surrender High Regent Salvan and every officer involved in the attack on the Velhari station, and submit them to a tribunal for judgment. And this is not a negotiation, and this is not a request. And if you do not comply, then what comes next will not be surgical. The planet below did not respond. Lena Vasquez waited. The stars around Kethforin seemed to dim, as if even they were holding their breath, and the galaxy watched and waited with them, because everyone knew that what happened next would define the shape of civilization for centuries to come. And in his throne chamber deep beneath the surface of his world, High Regent Salvan sat alone and stared at the ceiling, and for the first time in his very long life, he felt something he did not recognize. Later he would learn that the humans had a word for it. They called it fear. High Regent Salvan stood before the assembled commanders of his remaining military forces in the deep chambers beneath the surface of Kethforin, and he spoke with the voice of a leader who had ruled for longer than most human family trees could be traced, and he told them that this was the moment their civilization had been built for. He told them that the Athari were the oldest and the strongest and the most enduring species the galaxy had ever known, and he told them that they had broken every enemy that had ever dared to challenge them, and he told them that these humans were nothing more than emotional children playing at war, and that their fleet would shatter against the might of Kethforin like waves against ancient stone. His commanders listened, and some of them believed him, and some of them had seen the censored data from the 7th Armada, and believed something else entirely. But they were Athari, and obedience to the High Regent was woven into their culture like thread into cloth, and they followed his orders. Salvan commanded every remaining ship and every orbital platform and every ground-based weapon to engage the human fleet, and it was the largest single mobilization in Athari history. And when the order was given, the planet itself seemed to hum with the power being channeled through its defense. The Battle of Kethforin began at dawn by the planet's local time, and it was the largest single engagement in the recorded history of the galaxy. The Athari threw everything they had built over millennia at the human fleet, and for the first 20 minutes, the space around Kethforin became a storm of light and energy and metal that was visible from neighboring star systems, and the orbital platforms fired weapons that had been designed to crack asteroids, and the ground batteries sent beams into orbit that could have cut through mountains. The human fleet absorbed it all. The nano-armor on the human ships shifted and adapted in real time, and weapons that should have torn through hull plating were deflected or dispersed or simply swallowed, and the AI tactical networks coordinated the fleet with a speed and precision that made the human ships move like a single living organism with 1,000 bodies and one mind. Then the humans struck back. They did not target the cities on the surface, and they did not target the civilian infrastructure, and they did not target the population centers that held billions of Athari lives, and instead they targeted the machines of war with the same surgical precision they had used against the 7th Armada. Orbital platforms went dark one by one like candles being snuffed out, and warships lost power and drifted, and ground batteries fell silent, as their power cores were disabled from orbit with shots that should not have been possible through a planetary atmosphere. But the humans had built weapons that did not care about what should and should not be possible. The battle lasted 6 hours, and by the time it ended, the Athari war machine, that had been the most feared military force in the galaxy for 6,000 years, was gone. Not destroyed in the way that wars usually destroy things with craters and rubble and the smell of burning, but disabled and dismantled and taken apart piece by piece, while the people inside were left alive, and the cities below were left standing, and the air was still clean, and the water was still running. The Athari had no fleet and no orbital defenses and no communications network, and no way to call for help, and no way to fight back, and they were alone on their own world surrounded by silence, and the human fleet hanging above them like judgment itself. And then the humans came down. Not an army and not an invasion force, but a retrieval team of 50 operators in light armor, who descended through the atmosphere in a single dropship, and landed in the central plaza of the Athari capital city, and the citizens who watched from their windows saw the humans walk out of their ship and move through the streets with a calm purpose that was more frightening than any show of force could have been. The planetary defense grid that would have stopped any conventional ground assault did not exist anymore, and the security forces that would have intercepted intruders had no weapons that functioned, and the doors that would have sealed the government chambers had no power, and the humans walked through the heart of the Athari civilization as if it were an open field. They found Salvan in his throne chamber. He was sitting in the seat that his predecessors had occupied for thousands of years, and he was alone because his guards had abandoned their posts when their weapons stopped working, and he looked at the human soldiers standing in his doorway, and for a moment no one moved. The team leader was a woman named Sergeant Dara Okonkwo, and she was 31 years old, and she had a daughter back home who was 9, and she looked at Salvan and said, "High Regent Salvan, you are being taken into custody for the murder of Maya Vasquez, aged 8, and you will stand before a tribunal, and you will answer for what you have done." Salvan said nothing and stood and walked with them. They brought him and 11 of his officers to the orbital platform that the humans had constructed above Kethforin in the hours after the battle, and the tribunal was broadcast to every species on every world across the galaxy, and the viewership was the largest in the history of interstellar communications. The Korath served as neutral observers, and they sat in their ancient robes with their old eyes watching everything, and saying nothing, because they had waited a very long time for this moment. The evidence was presented with the cold efficiency that the galaxy was beginning to associate with everything humans did when they were angry, and it included the communications logs showing that the explosive device on the Velhari station had been planted on Salvan's direct orders, and it included the engineering reports proving the blast was deliberate and controlled, and it included the message that Salvan had sent afterward dismissing the death of a child as an inconvenience. Every species watched, and many of them had done similar things in their own histories, and had hidden them and forgotten them, and now they watched a civilization being held accountable, and it made them uncomfortable in ways they did not want to examine. Salvan was found guilty, and then humanity did something that no one expected. The galaxy had assumed that the humans would execute him, because that is what powerful species did when they won, and that is what the Athari would have done. And that is what the Confederacy had done for 6,000 years, and execution was the language of power that the galaxy understood. But the humans did not execute Salvan. Captain Lena Vasquez stood before the tribunal, and she held the folder of Maya's drawings, and she opened it, and placed one drawing on the display for the entire galaxy to see, and it showed a tall figure with stone-colored skin, standing next to a small girl with brown hair, and they were both smiling. "My daughter drew this the night before she was killed," Lena said. "She drew the man who ordered her death, and she drew him smiling because she thought he looked sad and she wanted to imagine him happy." The tribunal chamber was silent. Execution would end his suffering, Lena continued. That is not what we want, and we want him to understand what he took, and we want him to understand the weight of a single human life, and we want him to carry that understanding for every remaining day of his existence. The sentence was delivered, and it was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. High Regent Salvan was sentenced to live among humans. He would be taken to a human colony world, and he would live in a human community, and he would eat with human families and walk on human streets and watch human children play and grow and laugh and fight and forgive each other. And he would do this for the rest of his natural life, which for an Athari could be another 300 years. He would not be imprisoned, and he would not be restrained, and he would not be harmed, and he would simply be required to live among the species whose child he had killed, and to see every single day what a child means to the people around it. The galaxy did not know what to make of this. The species that had expected fire and destruction, and the grinding of an enemy into dust, watched the humans escort Salvan onto a transport ship, and they felt something shift beneath them like the ground moving under their feet, and they realized that they were not afraid of human weapons or human ships or human technology. They were afraid of a species that had the power to annihilate its enemy, and instead chose to make that enemy understand. Because annihilation ends and understanding does not. And Salvan sat in the transport ship as it carried him away from everything he had known, and he looked out the window at the stars, and they looked different now, and he did not know why, but he would learn. He would learn. The Confederacy of the 12 Suns dissolved on a quiet afternoon 6 weeks after the tribunal, and it did not end with a war or a revolution or a dramatic final session, but with a series of messages sent one after another from member species, who simply said they were leaving, and the last message came from the Selvani, whose children had drawn pictures with Maya in the garden of the Velhari station, and it said, "We should have spoken sooner, and we are sorry we did not." In its place, a new coalition began to form, and it was messy and slow and full of disagreements, because that is how things are when many different species try to build something together without one species holding a blade over the others, and the humans were offered a seat of leadership, and they refused it. "We did not do this to rule," Speaker Akafer told the assembly. "We did this because a child was killed, and if we take power from that, then we have turned our daughter's death into a political tool, and we will not do that." The assembly was quiet for a long time after she said that. But the humans did ask for one thing. They asked every member species to ratify a single law, and it was written in simple language that could be translated into any tongue without losing its meaning, and it was called the Maya Doctrine, and it said this: "No child of any species shall be considered collateral damage in any conflict or negotiation or act of state, and no young of any kind shall be used as leverage or threatened or harmed, as a means of exerting pressure, and the deliberate killing of a child shall be considered an act of war against all civilized peoples, regardless of the species of the child or the species of the one who took the life." It passed unanimously, and it was the first law in the history of the galaxy to do so. Every species signed it, and some of them signed it because they believed in it, and some of them signed it because they were afraid of what would happen if they did not, and the humans did not care about the reasons because the result was the same, and the law existed, and it had teeth. In the months that followed, the galaxy changed in ways that were visible and ways that were not. The visible changes were political and structural, and the new coalition built institutions and trade agreements and dispute resolution systems that were imperfect but functional. And the galaxy continued to spin, and commerce continued to flow, and species continued to argue about borders and resources, and all the ordinary things that civilizations argue about. The invisible changes were deeper. Every species in the galaxy began studying humanity with an intensity that bordered on obsession, and they studied human history and human culture and human biology and human psychology. And they were not studying because they wanted to understand how the human fleet worked or how the nano-armor was built. They were studying because they wanted to understand the unity. No species in the recorded history of the galaxy had ever mobilized so completely and so quickly with so little internal debate, and the military analysts could explain the technology, and the political scientists could explain the government structures, but no one could explain how an entire civilization of 12 billion individuals had looked at the image of a dead child and decided as one single organism what to do next. The Koreth published a paper that was read by every government in the galaxy, and it said that humanity's bond to its young was not merely cultural but biological and neurological, and that it ran deeper than reason or strategy or self-preservation, and that a threat to a human child activated something in the human brain that overrode every other consideration, including the instinct to survive. The paper concluded with a sentence that became the most quoted line in galactic academic history. Other species protect their young because it is logical, and humans protect their young because they cannot do otherwise, and this is the difference between a policy and a force of nature. Governments across the galaxy read that sentence and quietly increased their diplomatic courtesy toward human colonies. On the colony world of New Eden, in a small town surrounded by fields of engineered wheat and wildflowers that had been brought from Earth, a tall alien with stone-colored skin walked the streets, and no one bothered him, and no one shouted at him, and no one threw anything, and the humans who lived there simply let him exist among them. Solvan had arrived expecting punishment disguised as mercy, and he had expected cold stares and cruel whispers, and the slow, grinding humiliation of being a prisoner dressed as a guest, and he had prepared himself for hatred, because hatred was something he understood. What he got instead was worse. The family next door had 2 children, and the younger one was a girl of about 6 who was loud and fearless, and who climbed trees she could not get down from, and who cried when she skinned her knees, and who laughed so hard at dinner that milk came out of her nose, and who fell asleep in her father's arms every evening on the porch while he read to her. Solvan watched from his window every night. The father carried the sleeping girl inside with a tenderness that Solvan had no framework to understand, because the Athari raised their young in communal creches, where efficiency was the highest value and individual attachment was considered a weakness, and children were components of the species, rather than extensions of a parent's soul. He watched a boy fall off a bicycle, and watched the mother run from the house before the boy had finished crying, and watched her hold him and check his hands and blow on his scrapes, and tell him he was brave, and the boy stopped crying not because the pain was gone, but because his mother was there, and that was enough. He watched children fight over a ball in the park and scream at each other with genuine fury, and then 5 minutes later share food and laugh, as if nothing had happened, and he did not understand how the same small creatures could contain so much anger and so much forgiveness at the same time. He watched a father teach his daughter to ride a bicycle, and the daughter fell 7 times, and each time the father picked her up, and each time she got back on, and on the 8th try, she rode the length of the street, and the father cheered, and the sound of his voice carried something that Solvan had never heard in any Athari voice in 300 years of life. Months passed, and the invisible walls around Solvan's understanding began to crack. One evening, the girl from next door wandered into his garden while chasing a ball, and she looked up at him with no fear at all because children do not see monsters unless they are taught to. And she asked him why his skin was so shiny, and he told her it was because his species evolved on a world with very bright suns, and she said that was really cool, and asked if she could touch his hand, and he let her, and her fingers were so small against his palm that something inside him made a sound like a door opening. In a house that had been locked for a very long time. He went inside after she left and sat in the dark, and did not move for hours. The Athari did not cry because they had no tear ducts, and their biology had never required that particular expression of grief, But Solvan sat in his chair and felt something moving through him that he had no word for, and he understood for the first time that what he had done on the Velhari station was not a political calculation or a strategic decision. He had taken a universe away from someone. He had taken a girl who drew stars and who held alien hands, and who believed the galaxy was full of friends, and he had turned her into smoke and silence and scattered crayons. In his final recorded statement, which he transmitted to the Athari homeworld, and which was watched by billions of his own people, Solvan stood in the garden where the little girl had touched his hand, and he spoke in his own language, but the translators carried his words to every corner of the galaxy. I killed a child, and when I did it, I believed it meant nothing because she was small and human and unimportant. And I was wrong in a way that I will spend the rest of my life trying to comprehend. And I did not know what a child was, and now I do. And the knowing is heavier than any punishment they could have given me, and I will carry it until I die. On a quiet colony world 3 systems away from New Eden, Captain Lena Vasquez, who had resigned her commission and put away her uniform, opened a small school in a building with wide windows and green paint, and above the front door, she hung a drawing in a simple frame. The drawing showed a little girl with brown hair holding hands with a tall alien under a sky full of colored stars, and beneath it, in the careful, uneven handwriting of an 8-year-old, was a single word: friends. Children passed under that drawing every morning, and they did not know the story behind it, and they did not need to because the drawing spoke for itself. And it said that once there was a girl who believed the universe was kind, and even though the universe proved her wrong, the people who loved her made sure it would be kinder from now on. Years passed. On a morning that was ordinary in every way, a deep space monitoring station on the edge of human territory detected a signal that did not match any known species, and the signal was not random, and it was not natural, and it carried a message that was repeated in 1,000 languages, as if whoever sent it wanted to be understood by anyone who heard it. The message said, "We heard what you did for your child, and we have traveled a very long way, and we wish to know you." Humanity sent a response, and the response was simple and welcoming, and the stars that had gone silent with fear after the Battle of Kethforin began to fill with voices again, and the galaxy was larger than it had been before and stranger and more wonderful. And in a school on a quiet world, children drew pictures of aliens and humans holding hands under skis full of stars, and they did not know that they were carrying on the work of a girl who had believed that every stranger was a friend you had not met yet. They learned, as all the galaxy eventually would, that humanity's greatest weapon was never its fleet, and never its technology, and never its fury. It was the simple and terrifying fact that every human child is the entire universe to someone, and that someone will burn the stars to keep them safe. And the stars remembered. And the stars remembered.